Maybe I'll go ahead and start my long-winded introduction. So it's spring 2019, it's a spring-like day outside, it's 2019. In 2019, we commemorate the 93rd anniversary of the first volume of Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West. Some people would say it was all downhill since the fall of the Roman Empire. Oswald Spengler tended to write about things like the relationship between Faust and the soul and protons and Rutherford and so on. There's actually a different Spengler. It was Joseph Spengler, the Greek economist, who wrote France Faces Depopulation in the 30s, which I read as an undergraduate, and it got me interested in demography. It was a very interesting book, not at all prescient, totally wrong. It turns out Oswald Spengler probably had more to worry about because the French have secretly in their National Demography Institute charts showing when they'll pass the Germans, so it turns out that Spengler was wrong. But enough about me, because now that it is noon, I want to introduce my good friend and colleague, Tukufu Zuberi, a man, as they say, who needs no introduction. But if he did get an introduction, it would go something like this. Tukufu is the Lasry family professor of race relations here at the University of Pennsylvania. He's professor of sociology and Africana studies. In these precincts, he has been the chair of the graduate group in demography, the chair of the Department of Sociology. He does a lot of writing about a lot of things, certainly within demography. Well, I don't know where he started, but he's published on the demography of the return of African Americans to Liberia, the nature or misunderstanding of race in the social sciences. He was the founder of the African Census Analysis Project, which saved any number of African censuses, and they're now publicly available. Tukufu has also pioneered, don't anybody take this chair. Tukufu has also pioneered the use of multimedia methods and so on in making social science available to a larger community. So with that as only a brief introduction, Tukufu, it's all yours.
Thank you very much for your kind words, but I've known Herb for so long, I know he didn't even need to prepare for that. So, I should get an extra point from you all as I proceed. I'm gonna try to go fast because I've been working more recently on this book, which I started 20 years ago, but got disrupted because I really didn't understand what was going on about race or how we could properly study race. And then I got really involved and bogged down with a television show and learning stuff from that. And that's all past me at this moment, I think. So I have to return to this project about a couple of years ago, and have spent a lot of time giving a lot of presentations on the various chapters. It's not a very long book, but with some very deep chapters, I think. And the almost final chapter is called Fear of White Demographic Suicide. A couple of weeks ago, I presented another version of this. I tried to change it at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And it was a very interesting thing. I have never gone to a talk that had so much security. They had so much security that they didn't allow most of the people who wanted to come in because they didn't have tickets. So it was a very interesting thing. But previous to my conversation or my arrival, one of these individuals, who I won't mention her name, who is a kind of public intellectual, had given a talk about the decline of American society. And the decline of American society, and had talked, and her talk was mainly on how Black students and professors in university settings were bringing down the university. And, there had been protests all over the country about her talk. I didn't anticipate that there would be any kind of, I thought most people would look at this and say, okay, what is that? I don't want to go, or something like that. But I didn't expect to have a metal detector and all of that. So I'm pleased now to present this to you without the security and the alert, and they let you in the room. And I'm hoping you will get my point. Anyway, that's already taken 5 minutes.
Sounds like there's a knife here.
I thought that was for my protection. I thought that was for my protection. She's got my back. So let's start with 3 empirical examples of the changing racial classifications away from white population dominance. In 1999 or something like that, 2001, I published this particular graph, which is a little bit wrong, but it's right in the right direction. That is, the projections changed and the population that point at which the United States would become a so-called minority, majority country it happens a little bit sooner. But here, what I was trying to focus on is the changing racial composition of the United States, and talking about that racial compositional change is something that can happen. I'll come back to this a little bit later. Then a friend of mine was here in 2000, I think it was by 2003, right before the big Brazil IUSSP meeting. And he gave a talk, and I remember him running me down in the atrium saying, Tukufu, I figured it out. You just didn't take your graph, the previous things. You didn't take it far enough. Well, I've done it for Europe versus Africa. And look, Africa poses the perfect solution to European problems. They just need to regulate how Africa engages with Europe. I don't know if any of you were at that meeting, but he was kind of resoundingly what are you talking about? This is not a problem, it's not an issue. By 2006, it had become a very bona fide issue because, and this is a paper from David Coleman, in which he's talking about what he ends up calling a third demographic transition, and basically a transition happening in Europe at this moment, and showing all of the countries where these changes are going, and looking at the very fact that most or a large number of the European populations were either stagnant or beginning to approach a point of decline, and with these large number of migrants coming in, their proportionate significant impact on the country would be communities. Now let me try to put those realities, which I think have been discussions among scholars about this change, which is happening, and it's happening not only in the United States, it's happening around the world. So as I see it, the idea of the post-racial world is a myth. It didn't happen. If you were studying race, you probably never thought it was going to happen, but you could see it as the rhetoric of those who weren't following the path of race or racial articulations in various societies around the world. In fact, at that moment in which the post-racial was supposed to exist, we saw a heightening of consciousness around the world about race and about racial differences. And we saw the racialization of more groups of people, especially as they appeared in societies which were racially stratified. Now, the changing demography of racial classification is by definition a problem, if you use my definition, which I'm going to give you in a moment. And the problem is international in scope and historical insignificance. I have tended to be very historical in my work, and this work is continuing that. There's a lot of analysis of these people who really inspired folks like her to get involved in demography and the problems with their ideas and how their problems kind of help pollute the field in a major way. And what I think we need to do if we will ever get beyond the racial demography, which I think is what most people do, even when they think they're not talking about race. Because part of their not talking about race is the way that we have talked about race, the way we viewed race, but in some ways has not been the way that race is practiced in societies. So many of the great thinkers of population conclude that the future is based on our evaluation of the past and the hopes for the future. Because, in a big way, what population scientists are good at is trying to capture the trends and to capture those trends before and to make projections after in terms of where we will go, what kind of policies we need, what impact policies can have, and the potentials of things like that. For Malthus, Ehrlich, Simon, and Cohen, the population question is a moral value issue. And it's always interesting to me that these conclusions they end up writing in their very important books end up with a discussion about how we value other people, how we think about them, what rights we think they have, and the kind of resources which should be expended regarding the problems which surround them, the social problems which impact their life. So I want to contend that the morality of this question is rooted in the power to define who is human and who is deserving of dignity. So that the issue of the moral values is in part a question about power, and a question about power to define who and what a human being is. So demography was born using data that was collected for political reasons. These enumerations have been used to define what it means to be a human being and what it means not to be a human being. Now, the United States is classic example of this because the U.S. Constitution undefined the Native American population as being worthy of consideration by calling them the uncivilized. It further undefined the humanity of the population which was coming from Africa by basically calling them 3/4 of a man. So by definition, even the question of the statistics that were being used, they were being collected within this racist context. Now, if you look at those censuses, which I have spent some time looking at, of the United States, especially those in the 19th century, what you see is changes in the language in terms of reference for racial references for who is who and who has what kinds of rights. But these counts, these references, define or undefine who can be colonized, enslaved, and otherwise marginalized. There was I forgot a book. I wanted to quote from this book and I was going to get it, but then I saw the time was almost 12 o'clock and Herb would have probably started without me, so I ran back down without my book. But Chamberlain, who was the Prime Minister of Britain, once famously talked about and compared Europe, or compared Britain with the United States. And he said, we in Britain, we have 50 million people. And in the United States at this moment, there were 70 million people. But he said, our numbers are far greater than those in the United States because we also have 350 million people who are under our civilization, under our umbrella of rule and governance. And he said, with this 350, now we have 400 million compared to the 70 million in the United States. And then he said, now, not all of those people are white. And when he said that, the whole hall broke out into laughter. I mean, I can't find the tape of that, but that's what it said. The whole hall broke out into laughter. And it's interesting that he would say that because it shows that his conceptualization of the colonized population of Britain were considered in the same derogatory way that he was referring to the non-white population in the United States. So a major unrecognized preoccupation of demography is race. Now, there have been a number of scholars who demographers have not studied and have not been aware of, and Malthus wasn't in conversation with them. Ehrlich wasn't in conversation with them, and definitely Ehrlichman wasn't in conversation with them. Joel wasn't in conversation with them. Just so many people have not been in conversation with these scholars who have studied the problem of race. And here I just mentioned a few names: Du Bois, Sinclair Drake, Patricia Hill Collins. And for them, the race question is a question of moral and political values as well. And I think it's important to recognize them, because what I am actually trying to do is put them in conversation with each other. That is, what if these scholars who thought they didn't need to read the race literature would have actually read it and engaged with it? What would it have done to their demographic imagination, if you will? How would it have impacted what they saw? And so I'm going to just give a quick run through about how I think it would have impacted what they saw. So first I got to do this really fast, and that is what I mean by race, because what I mean is extremely stylized based on the current research about race, based on those debates and the implications they have with our empirical work. Some of this I covered, most of this I covered in a book that I did write 20 years ago called Thicker Than Blood: How Racial Statistics Lie, which came as a result of writing papers and publishing articles on race. It made me really uncomfortable because of what I thought I was saying race was. So I'm going to say that race is an illusion of, the illusion of race is socially real. One of my basic points, I want to say that. All right? The illusion of race is socially real. That is, race is not an illusion. The idea that it's an illusion is based in a notion that it is somehow biologically real. But I kind of go back to the whole Durkheimian thing where there are social facts and social realities, and that those social realities do not have to be grounded in a biological fact. That is, okay, we have to exist, we have to have brains, we have to do all of those things, but what we create in society is not simply a function of this physical reality. So one, race is, this is Tukufu Zuberi's Race 101. A couple of students in here have seen me do this. So I'm going to do it really quickly for you all because I know you will grasp the point. Race is not genetic, okay? In 2000, there was a meeting at the White House called by Bill Clinton to announce the almost completed genome projects, both private and the public and their combination. One of the clear things they said is that there is no evidence in our data to substantiate that race exists. There is one group of people from the genomic point of view, they are humans, and you will not be able to reconstitute them. That is, if you took a random sample of the people in this room, took their DNA, you would not be able to assign them then to different races just looking at that genomic information. So the mythology that goes with even some of the contemporary work attempting to use the genomic research to define race is that it is faulty because they start with the false notion of race in the beginning. And some of the recent work of Professor Sarah Tishkoff and her colleagues stand out as the recent debunking of the persistent idea of race as a biological reality. Point two, race is not a system of color. Mixing black and white, two of the signature ways of thinking about race, doesn't really make the gray that you would want. So that the idea of race as a system of color requires us to think with a white logic. What do I mean by a white logic?
The history of the development of the idea of race that we use now comes out of an idea of white supremacy, an idea of white people having an existence which makes them pure. All of the other ideas of race are about the people who are less pure, and they're less pure for one reason or another. So it stands to reason that if the original human populations, and this is a quote, contains the skin color variation of all the African diaspora population, and that's everybody in the room and everybody on planet Earth, according to Tishkoff and her people, then humans are not divided into races, biological races, as they're called. So race is not a system of color. Okay, I'm going to re-emphasize that. I said this at a talk I was giving in California, and one of the people had just written a book on race as a system of color, and they were trying to explain to me how it worked. And so this is my general response to that, is that scientifically, human visual perception of color comes from the stimulation of cells in the human eye by electromagnetic radiation in the spectrum of light. Now, in the spectrum of light, you can't mix these two colors. That is because white reflects all colors and black is the absence of color. So it just doesn't work like that. So the illogical belief of race as skin color is a social construction. Now I say this because literally when people talk about race, if you talk about race in Brazil and you're talking about people who are black and people who are white, you don't necessarily use those two words. You use the word Negro and you use the word, you call somebody black, you might have a whole bunch of other variations in there. But there's some notion that black people are this and they have these certain stereotypes that go with it. White people are this and they have these stereotypes that go with it. But I'm saying to get the people to be black and white requires a certain kind of illogical notion. Because if you gave birth, or these two people had sex and gave birth and they reproduced a child, then you wouldn't expect the child to come out as gray. And that is the only thing black and white could produce, is various shades of gray within that process. So, I would suggest that race is socially constructed to facilitate inequality. I think there's a substantial amount of research which supports this, but that this is probably all race has ever done. There has never been a society in which there has been racial tranquility. It doesn't exist. People don't sit around the racial table and negotiate the distribution of power and resources. It is always about conflict. The notions that we use about race in most sociological analysis is grounded in this theory of the race cycle in which assimilation was the prime notion. And so we very rarely interrogate what we mean by assimilation or what we mean by this integration of population and the implications of it, but part of it was based in a notion that race was genetically real and that colonized populations could be assimilated and integrated into the colonizing population. So racial categories are artificially defined by human beings using religion, culture, and physical appearance. No one has ever used biological tests to determine what race someone is. If you go into Bogota and you find someone who is a black person in Bogota, they were not given a biological test to determine that they were black. The same thing is true in South Africa. The same thing is true in the United States. So race is a hierarchical system of human relations, a system arranged in order of rank. Now, all race occurs within a national context, and all nations experience racial transitions, and in societies with white supremacy, there persists a fear of white demographic suicide. And you can express this in lots of ways on how you contain the savage, how you contain the non-white, how you kind of create a space for allocating resources that complements these barriers to what would be thought to be an anticipated assimilated society. So that's what I mean when I say race is socially real. I mean that social reality is grounded in this idea of a system of hierarchical human relationships. Now, demographically, racial classification and the system of white supremacy has had a profound impact on humanity, so that the idea of race in the United States is grounded most fundamentally on a notion of the superiority of white people. Unless there has been an intellectual revolution that happened in the last few weeks, that has always been the way that it is. And there's all kinds of evidence popping up everywhere, even on the news, that it has not changed. And so that the white supremacy that we were talking about that led to the colonization of the Americas persists today, even in different forms. So here's one thing. Lots of demographers, we like to think that that the human population reached 1 billion around 1800 because of the Columbian Exchange. And this resulted because of better food, it resulted because of improvements in health, and because all of these things which occasioned as a result of Europeans going out of Europe to the Americas, to Africa, to Asia, and bringing back some of the benefits, but also bringing back a lot of the food. Now, that's one way to look at it, and it's a very, and the logic of looking at that is looking at it like that is you have to look at the world from Europe, and you have to imagine that what Europe does is good for the world, okay? Because in reality, we know that the human population reached 1 billion around 1800 because of the sacrifices of the indigenous populations in Africa, in Asia, and the Americas, and some of the islands. The devastation of African populations, the devastation of Native American populations, the devastation of Asian populations fueled and spurred the economic development of Europe. More recently, even in the United States, there's been a long history of denial, going all the way back to the Dunning School of the Reconstruction period, not having, the period of enslavement, not having a positive impact on the American economy. But that in essence, the argument has been the opposite of what the rest of the world would have seen. Because definitely the Native Americans did not see the advantages of the colonization of America. The creation of the United States was not a thing which fostered Native American population growth, which was that first figure that I showed you. So the power to racially define is a fundamentally important power. I want to give you a couple of examples of this, but let me be clear on what I mean by that. Enumerations are used to define the rights of a class of people. Now that's what happens in terms of the practice of these racial classifications. They become part of the state apparatus. Now these signs, or these counts, as I mentioned earlier, they define or undefine who can be colonized, enslaved, and otherwise marginalized. So that the system of racial classification are always, and that should be are, not or, are time and place specific. For example, race in Brazil, South Africa, and the United States are different. To me, it's always been a kind of absurdity to think that you're talking about the same thing when you say the African American population in the United States has a certain rate, and then you compare that rate with a rate in Brazil, where the system of racial classification is different, where the process of racial transitions are different, and where the history is different. But we do that thinking that by doing it, somehow we're making a lot of sense. I even think that even looking at indices of racial discrimination in the two places is a mistake, because it doesn't facilitate our appreciation of what we're doing. And especially doesn't appreciate how profound an impact we have as intellectuals on the process of what we're calling race in these specific places. So let me give a couple of examples of this social construction of the racial transitions away from white population dominance and how I put my charts together. I want to talk to you about that. This is just a measure. I figured I should show you all the equation, how I created the line so you'll kind of appreciate the significance of my line as I show it to you. This is Brazil. And what I did is I went through the data on Brazil, the racially classified data in Brazil, which doesn't exist for every 10 years. There are some periods which the classifications change. There are some periods in which no racial data is collected. So what I did is I constructed racial categories that were consistent over time. And so I constructed a racial category which was white or which was black over time, and I allowed that racial category to guide my determination of other years. And no matter what the people were called, I was trying to use a definition that they used in 2010 and went back. This is in itself a social construction by the scholar. If any of you have ever used racial data and have ever looked at it historically, you've had to do this because the classifications have changed in the United States. The classifications have changed in Brazil. The classifications have changed in South Africa. So it's a process you have to go through in order to get there. But the interesting thing about Brazil is you see increasing racial diversity in terms of this index. Kind of stagnates a little bit. But you see a lot of fluctuation in the composition, the racial composition of the population. One of our graduate students went through and checked this data because he wanted to know if this increasing black population, and the black population is a combination of the brown and the black populations here, if this was a result of the higher fertility of the black population, if it was a result of more migration of black people. And he came to the conclusion that no, it was not. It was a process of people changing their racial classification that led to Brazil becoming a majority black population. Here's another example of a changing racial classification. To do this in South Africa really requires creativity. It requires creativity or a very firm notion in your brain, what is a black person and what is a white person. And if you have that very clear in your brain, that's part of what I'm saying is problematic. Because having it very clear in your brain is a myth unless you're spending the same kind of time figuring out who is black and who is white over time. Because the classifications change. And they change from large numbers of classifications to very small numbers of classifications. I made decisions and I collapsed them and I produced this time series of racial classifications. Now, South Africa is a little bit different because in South Africa, the shifting index of racial diversity is going down because of the increase in the black population and the colored population as a consequence of having higher birth rates and having more higher rates of immigrants coming from different African countries. So those are two different ways in which these things could change based on my classification or my constructed classification over time to produce the series of data on which they are presented to you here. Okay, let me try to conclude quickly here with three kinds of fear. The fear among population scientists dates back to the guy who inspired Herb, all the way to current conversations about the declining population of Europe, the loss of Western culture and Western values, and the threat of migrants from Mexico and Nicaragua and El Salvador. And the fear among everyday people is continuing to be captured by social scientists. And then there was the political implications have led to a rise of a new right grounded in racism. I mean, the eugenics movement is, if you don't know, you should know more about it, was a movement based in the fear of demographic decline. The fear, and this demographic decline is what I am calling demographic suicide of the white population. And it has had a continuing legacy in the population sciences and especially by people who look at the changing racial composition as further evidence of the process of suicide at a population level, not suicide at the individual level. I understand in the United States we have the rise of white male suicide. That's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a fear of demographic suicide, which is grounded in this notion of becoming progressively a minority, although if South Africa is any evidence, that doesn't necessarily translate into political power. The current concerns regarding the declining white populations of Europe and the United States are motivated by these similar concerns. So if you go back, maybe many of you read Coleman's work or his paper on the third demographic revolution, a transition, then you notice that there is a concern that there needs to be some way to protect the white population from the onslaught of immigrants from Syria, the immigrants from Somalia, the immigrants from those places where people are classified as different, either by their religion, either by their country of origin, or what have you. So that the recent social psychological research suggests that white populations in Europe and the United States have become more racially conservative when made aware of the so-called majority-minority racial transition in the composition of the population. Now, researchers who study segregation, and you can even find this in Camille Charles's summary article of this literature, but definitely in her book, Would You Be My Neighbor, that if you show people these diagrams, this is just a recent manifestation of it, you show them these diagrams of how black a neighborhood would they tolerate. People would tolerate all kinds of scenarios of integration. But the larger, the more there's a certain tipping point with which they say no more black people in my neighborhood. They're not trying to be in a black majority neighborhood because there's all kinds of stigmas attached to that. Well, the social psychologists, I think, the social psychologists, there's a growing body of literature, and this is just some of the literature, where they've done something which I think is very interesting. They've asked people what they thought about diversity and what they thought about increasing diversity in their community. And then they give them a series of questions about, then they give them some information about the impending future demographic changes, the reality of what is about to happen, about this minority majority which is coming. And this is kind of a summarizing quote, the body of this work, is that whites may become increasingly likely and motivated to support conservative candidates and policies in response to the changing racial demographics. The more the population knows about the changing racial demographics of the population, the more they don't support immigration, the more they don't support changing the racial composition of their neighborhood, the more they don't support the integration of the political structures in the country. That is, allowing people who are not from the country, are not seen as being from the country, to be there 3, 4, 5, 6 generations, then there's a fear of their participating in the political process. And the political implications, I could go on and on, but I want to give time for any questions you might have, are pretty strong, and they're pretty international. I mean, I could have put a picture up here of Bolsonaro. I could have put a picture up here of so many politicians in Europe. That is, the political implications of this fear of a white demographic suicide is very strong, and it has taken the world by a very firm grip and has led to all kinds of politics. Probably the most successful anti-racial movement in end of the 20th century with South Africa. And it gave us symbols to really understand what race was about. And part of the way that it presented it is in this system called apartheid. And you could think of apartheid as not necessarily a wall, but a metaphor for a wall. Something. If it's not a wall, it is something that keeps people apart. And the fear of white demographic suicide is resulting in more calls for international and domestic forms of apartheid. And these are articulated in all kinds of ways. We can talk about those. Give you tons of examples. So I'm pretty much an advocate in this process. I'm not neutral. I don't believe, like Trump, that there are good people on both sides of this debate. I think there are people who, some of them have good intentions, but are doing wrong things that are having tremendous impacts on the lives of people who have to live in racially stratified spaces. So I think the fear of demographic racial suicide among scholars and everyday people, and the least among politicians, is extremely problematic. Thank you.
Let's go into some time for discussion. Folks.
Yes, sir.
So what do you think about the, Deaton and, the economists who brought up, the actual suicide, brought up, the fact that white male suicide has been going up. To what extent do you think the concern about that is actually a reflection of what you're talking about?
Yeah, and I've seen a lot of, so you get a lot of people, some people saying it's the fear of all these people coming in and losing the white majority. Other people talk about the lack of real improvements in income and life ability. So you get a lot of discussion about the reasons for it. And so I'm not really trying to do, Durkheim wrote the famous book, Suicide, right? And part of the problems is ecological fallacy in there, so he could say some of the stuff he said, which ended up not being so correct. So I'm not necessarily saying that white people, especially white men, are committing suicide because they looked up and said, the Mexicans are coming, the Mexicans are coming. And so I think that it's a bigger problem.
But what about the concern that people have? I mean, do you think that there's a heightened concern about it in the political context of,
Well, I think that
Do white people take it seriously?
in other words, why is this a crisis versus, other potential health crises out there?
Yeah, I mean, but that's part of the racial idea of American society. If the people who are classified as white have a problem, it becomes the problem, and it becomes a moral problem. It's kind of like the crises with the opioids at this moment. I mean, it would be very interesting saying we need to heighten the police patrols in the white neighborhoods, we need to build more prisons, and we need to be more tough on these drug addicts, and you have an entirely different kind of conversation. But that's part of the conversation of race. That's why I always think, people can think they're not talking about race. In a racially stratified society, it's extremely difficult to do that. In a world impacted by racial stratification, it's very difficult to do that. It's almost like hiding from the elephant that's sitting in the middle of the room. So there are many social problems that can be dealt with. And then this idea that the crisis is grounded in the rise of white male suicide. I don't doubt that its increase is a problem, okay? And I don't wish suicide on more men classified as white in that way. Yes, sir.
I think there's also a myth about white men, including the white women, whose life expectancy is declining fast. But going back to your point, if it wasn't white, when we got to the opioids and it was affecting mostly whites, there was a huge outcry. Look at in the 1980s when black life expectancy declined. and it was partly due to, I think, the crack epidemic, and there was no outcry. And there were no solutions to the things. And that was
The outcry in the 80s was build more jails, lock these people up.
But that's when their life expectancy was declining. And I remember writing about it because this was unusual and we didn't expect to have in any developed country have declining life expectancy. There wasn't that much concern about it, but now we have white, so I mean, I think this does
Well, the
play into
concern
your
was there.
narrative, it's
The concern, look, Clinton, and by the 90s, Clinton was passing all these laws to increase the number of prisons because, this is how it was responded to. I do not think the response is going to be build more prisons to lock up more white people. Doesn't even sound like it's gonna happen as I say it. Did you have something?
And it's going on a different theme, so if there is a final thought on this. I think this is fascinating, and what I'm wondering if you have observed, so like oftentimes demographic panics come together with like higher kind of like pressures on controlling women's reproductive decisions, and that might be like forcing white women into like making more babies, or like forcing white women into having less babies, like including forced sterilization. And if you have observed in your study of where this, I guess, increased panic around increased rate for racial diversity of population is coming together with kinds of discussions around reproductive health and women's decisions around that.
So there's that subtext in demography is always there. And that subtext in the literature on race and fertility is always there. I wrote a paper a long time ago called Racial Stratification and Fertility, in which I was trying to argue that by saying that there's an undertone of most of the conversations about fertility, which is purely about race, especially when people think they're studying fertility in Africa. So the logic that is used to look at fertility among white women in Europe is not the same logic that is used to look at fertility of black women in the United States. The logic of looking at the fertility of white women in the United States is not the same as looking at the fertility of Native American women. And what I'm suggesting is that in part, this is because of a hierarchy in the knowledge and that we use, because we think we're not talking about race, but we end up talking about it in our indirect ways. And so the history, as Herb so eloquently put it out there, the history of these ideas about fertility and population growth have always been grounded in these concerns for white survival. Okay, whether it's in Brazil, whether it's in France, in Britain, in the United States, wherever there has been this legacy of creating these systems of racial classification, there has been that. The role and place of women in this context has been fundamental. And talking about the reproductive attitudes and beliefs and practices and needs and contributions of these women have always been articulated within these racial ways. So the questions that have been asked about Africa are very different than the questions that have been asked about Europe and the United States, and about white populations in other countries where there's this kind of racial division going on.
on top of that, there was a recent article that came out, I don't remember that there were more white deaths than white births that resonated in the public imagination.
Yeah, so Tukufu, I wanted to ask you something. So you pointed out, on the phone, Melissa gave a talk about the related things as well. So, there's a long intellectual history of, you were just saying about race and demography and so let's think about both the present and the future. I mean, for those of us, people in the room who are demographers and so on. So, there's kind of like two positions, two standard positions. One I would say is the US one, and you guys say, well, we gotta measure this stuff because we gotta, show where there's inequality, and then you go to France and they say, well, no, we're not supposed to measure this stuff because that helps reify it makes things up. It's up there, and then you gotta look around and go, well, you hypocrites, you're just trying to cover up what you're doing. So, moving forward, the past is the past. I've never really known what to do with so-called race as a variable. I mean, past a certain point, I was starting to scratch my head and thinking, what am I doing?
In most societies, people don't think race is an actual variable. That is, they don't think that it's something that varies over the course of an individual's life. They believe that a person is born a certain race and they will die that race. And they're willing to fight wars and kill lots of people on the basis of knowing what their race has been and what their race could be, and the implications of that for the relationship with the other races. And so what I was trying to suggest is that I do not know, and I've been studying this a lot for a long time, of any situation where there has been racial peace. So now the idea that you can solve this problem by studying it, I think, has been a myth as well. Because if you don't appreciate the politics of what you're studying, then you don't really have a chance of dealing with this problem. There's one thing that W.E.B. Du Bois used to do in every book he wrote, and you can go check it out. He would start off by saying, I'm going to do something that will just dismiss many of my potential readers. They will not be able to read the book. He said, I'm going to assume that the Negro is a human being. Okay. First, I read that and I just went on. Then he said in every book. And he wrote a couple of articles which were just on that. Because I think what his point was is we spend a lot of time trying to find out what is wrong with the black population. Why aren't they doing this? We study things like, why are they going to prison so much? Why are they getting stopped by the police so much? And we study that as if they were the problem. So there's that assumption which is built in it, which makes the Negro the problem, which is adverse to what we tend to do once we make the assumption that people are a human being, which is study the social problems that the people have. But since we have a group which is racialized, we end up studying them as the problem, which is where we get into this idea of well, it doesn't even work out, because it's not fictional that we say when they're black, they're like this, and then we see, or we don't say that if the person is, black level 5, then we're going to see this effect. But if they're black level 10, just open the gates of prison for them. We don't do that, and nor do we think we could do that. But we have an idea that it is the blackness, it is the racial characteristics of them that are putting them in the situation they're in. And so I think this leads to, for example, misuse of biometric data. So if you're collecting DNA data, trying to find something which is a special thing that black people have, you're already wrong from the start. And then you're digging the hole deeper once you find something that you think is indicating that, because it's built on the false idea of race. So I would say using race in that way is part of what the problem is. But I would agree that if you do not capture the data, you're going to have a very serious problem. The place that we saw this more recently being acted out is in South Africa, because immediately upon coming into power, the government said we eliminate all of these racial classifications, because they had a practical experience in which the information was collected, and it was collected for the purpose of doing great harm to the population that was classified as black. They weren't collecting this information for scientific purposes. They were collecting it for political purposes aimed specifically at a group, and we could see that very clearly. And I think that today we think that there became this neutral moment when we were collecting this racial data and analyzing this racial data, that somehow we left all of those eugenic ideas behind. And I've suggested this before, we didn't. And in part, it has led to very bad analysis. That's why I do not, and most of you know this is not a mystery to me, I do not think we are doing good analysis of race. So if we would, and there are people who are beginning to do good stuff, and I don't want to reduce the significance of their work, but those people who are looking at it, for example, as a contextual variable and trying to look at the percentage, for example, that are there, or the degree of interaction, or trying to drill down to what do we mean when we say something is an area is more integrated, or an area is more diverse. Exactly what does that mean, and how does that work itself out in these racial contexts? So I would not argue so much against the elimination of the racial data as a reformation of how we talk about it. Because I always thought this question about the police and the driving while black thing, the whole driving while black, y'all heard driving while black? Police stop you if you're driving while you're black, and the police stop you. I just thought this is a stupid idea, because the police don't have to be white, they don't have to be Latino, they don't have to be Asian, they don't have to be black, they could be any of those, and they're still stopping you. So it's not a question of the police, it's really a question, it's not a question of the people driving, it's really a question of the police, and the police idea about race, and their ideas about the people in these cars.
Oh, yeah, this is very interesting. Can you go back to your definition of race?
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you about this because
Or this thing? Or
no,
this?
the next one, this one. Are by human beings using religion, culture, and physical appearance. And I was thinking about the groups that have different religions, different culture, but don't get constructed as racial groups.
Which one?
And Southern whites, for instance. I'm thinking about Southern whites.
Yeah.
Southern whites, you can say they have different religion, different culture, but they don't get constructed as race.
But I'm saying,
Or across countries.
I'm saying you just did it.
No,
You
I'm
constructed
saying
as Southern
across
white.
countries, for instance, you can take Indians from India.
Yeah.
In the US, they don't get perceived as a threat. In Britain, they do. Latinos and so, and I think we talked about this, and I don't think I think that I'm thinking about the history of colonialism as a significant moment in the construction of racial groups. I think that, because I'm thinking, why are Latinos can be constructed as a racial group in the US? And the only thing that really comes to mind is that, the US has a colonial history with Latin America. So it has to be constructed as a group that gets oppressed. And for instance, in David, you cite David Coleman. David Coleman thinks that Polish people are changing whiteness in Britain. That he's not talking about, he's talking about the groups that Britain colonized. And Indians in Britain are a threat, but not in the US, because we do have a different history of colonialism. So I wonder if there's not something, really to make this definition really historical, to think about that it's really the outcome of colonialism and constructing the group as colonized and colonizer, constructing the group as somebody that you can kill, and because, and in that dynamic.
So I don't totally disagree with you. In fact, I agree with you in this way. I think the colonialism that occasioned after 1500 and was primarily the process of Europeans colonizing various parts of the world, from New Zealand, Australia, Canada, United States, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, all of these places, that this colonial experience began to write in our collective memory what race is in a very different way. And we begin to look at differences in religion, differences in culture, and differences in physical appearance in different ways as markers in that way. So that, for example, the Southern whites are racialized. They're racialized as Southern whites. Trump is not called a white president because all the presidents have been white, and Barack Obama is called a black president, not because he was the president of black people, nor was he the president of African people, nor was he the president of Kenyan people. He was the president of the United States of America. But he was thought of as the first black president. And being racially classified in that way in this case kind of confirms the point, right? Because if he's a black president, then all the others have been white presidents. But to call Trump, nobody's talking about the first white president or the really, really white president, or first orange president we've ever had is Trump. Nobody is saying anything like that. And so I think that today what we find is this system of race. It articulates itself differently in different places, being articulated in Britain based on the circumstances in Britain today and based on the history in Britain, so that even people rewrite the history. I mean, the president of Georgetown in 1867 was born of a slave woman and a Georgia plantation owner who sent him away to get educated, and he was a white president of Georgetown University until 1947, when some researchers said, hey, this guy had a slave mother. He said, wow, oh my gosh. Then Georgetown took advantage of that in the 80s and said we had a black president in the 19th century. So, I think that what I was trying to do, so I'm conscious of this. I'm trying to be sensitive to how race is used in different spaces at different times. And to define it in that way kind of removes you from saying black people, white people, just the system of classification, to what is it that's in that system of classification. I mean, I'm not sure what decision has been made in terms of the racial classification of Syrians, for example. I mean, will they continue to be classified as white as we go through this experience where there's a certain way that people are thinking about people from Syria, about people from Iran, about people from Iraq? And the decisions that were made to classify them as white are when they were not considered this threat. I mean, this is Oliver Cox. He argued that as long as the minority is sufficiently small, there is no threat by that minority. And if there is no threat, they can be classified as part of the powerful group, not necessarily just the majority group, but the powerful group. And that their incorporation can be unencumbered, that is their participation in the society. Whereas now you get the highest educated immigrants coming from Africa, but coming into a system of racial stratification that doesn't care about their higher education as a first encounter. It cares about their racial designation, whether they understand it or not, because it's not asking that they understand, it's putting them in a context in which racial classification takes place.
Tukufu, fantastic, thank you.